Welcome back to Live from Paris. You're watching France 24, the headlines today. The EU's top diplomat prepares to meet Russia's foreign minister, pressure growing to punish Moscow for jailing opposition leader Alexei Navalny and detaining thousands of his supporters. This war has to end. US President Joe Biden withdraws US support for a grinding 5-year-long military offensive in Yemen, saying it's time for US foreign policy to focus on diplomacy and democracy. And we head to the capital of the Central African Republic, Bangui, where food is becoming scarce and prices are rising amid an ongoing standoff between the army and a rebel coalition. Great to have you with us. Also coming up in the programme, we meet the artist creating a buzz with his vast wall murals depicting thousands of bees. An attempt, says artist Matthew Wiley, to paint the human race into a collective hive. The EU's foreign policy chief is in Moscow for a 3-day trip as pressure mounts to confront the Kremlin over the jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny on Tuesday. Josep Borrell is expected to address a recent crackdown on dissent in the country, with at least 10,000 people arrested for taking part in pro-Navalny demonstrations in recent days. Marius Sophos has the story.
In a message posted to his Instagram account, jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny urged his supporters to stand strong in the face of intimidation.
They can hold on to power, using it for personal gain, only by relying on our fear. But we, having overcome fear, can free our homeland from a handful of thieves in power. Let's do it. We must do it.
The comments follow his sentencing to 2.5 years in prison on Tuesday and come in the wake of mass protests across Russia, which have drawn tens of thousands of people over the past 2 weeks. It's been the largest show of discontentment with Vladimir Putin's rule in years. So far, thousands of protesters have been detained under grim conditions by authorities. In recent days, the friends and relatives of jailed protesters have queued up for hours at detention centres, bearing food and supplies for their loved ones.
Я приехала поддержать подругу, помочь с какими-то нужными вещами. И, честно, вообще никогда с этим не сталкивалась. Просто приезжаю, смотрю, что происходит, ничего не понятно. Поддержка, важная вещь.
Что это? Это просто неимовернейшее безобразие. В России закона нет, и, к сожалению, мы это убедились в этом, когда посадили Алексея Анатольевича Навального. И, к сожалению, сейчас людей берут без разбора на Преображенской площади.
The Kremlin has cast the arrests as a justified response to the demonstrations, which it says are unsanctioned.
The leaders of France and Germany are set to meet by video conference later this Friday for their annual meeting of the Franco-German Defence and Security Council. Top of the agenda, delays in the rollout of the bloc's vaccination programme and the increasingly contentious issue of the Nord Stream gas pipeline project from Russia to Germany. Paris is in favour of halting the project as punishment for Russia's jailing of Alexei Navalny. Berlin wants it to go ahead. The US is withdrawing its support for the ongoing Saudi-led offensive against Houthi rebels in Yemen and will no longer be selling precision-guided munitions to either Saudi Arabia or the UAE. President Joe Biden telling diplomats at the State Department that the 5-year-long war has created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. Monty Francis has the details.
In a major reversal of American foreign policy, President Joe Biden called the war in Yemen a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe, saying the U.S. would end American support for offensive operations there.
This war has to end. And to underscore our commitment, we are ending all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales.
What began as an internal struggle turned into a regional proxy war in 2015, when a Saudi-led coalition began an offensive against a Yemeni Houthi faction backed by Iran. A Saudi-led air campaign has since killed scores of civilians and produced what the United Nations has called the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Human rights researchers have documented many American-made bombs that have been used against civilians and traced them to defense contractors in the U.S. Biden's announcement is a stark turn from the policy of the Trump White House. The previous administration fully backed the Saudis in the conflict and supplied them with arms. And then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo branded the Iranian-linked Houthi rebels as terrorists, a move complicating Biden's desire to restart diplomacy with Iran.
We're going to continue.
While pulling support from the offensive, Biden said the U.S. would still support Saudi Arabia's right to defend its territory and its sovereignty.
French Prime Minister Jean Castex has said that the current coronavirus situation in the country does not justify a new national lockdown. Castex instead urging people to stick with the restrictions already in place, which include a nationwide 6 p.m. curfew. He also addressed the slow rollout of France's vaccination programme, explaining it was in part due to a decision to focus first on residents of care homes. Let's take a listen.
A new lockdown can only be considered as a last resort. The current situation does not justify this. Our level of new cases is admittedly high, but still far below this past October. Even though we still test thoroughly, I want to be clear. If the situation quickly gets worse, if we are forced to do so, we would not hesitate to take the necessary steps.
Now, while the vast majority of France has, at least for now, avoided a third lockdown, it is a different story for the French overseas territory of Mayotte. The island, located off the coast of Mozambique, is to enter a 3-week lockdown amid high rates of COVID transmission, blamed on the prevalence of the South African variant of the virus there. Sweden has thrown its weight behind the idea of a so-called digital vaccination passport, which would allow people who've received a COVID jab to freely travel once again. Denmark launched its own similar programme earlier this week and hopes to roll it out within months. But scepticism remains high in many parts of the EU, with some fearing the creation of a system that would confer different rights on different citizens, not to mention the practical considerations. Ellen Gainsford takes a look.
Scenes like this may feel like a distant memory, but with coronavirus vaccines being rolled out in many countries, there's hopes a return to normality could be within sight. These digital documents could be key in making that happen. Vaccine passports that prove a person has been inoculated. The Danish government has launched a scheme in cooperation with business organisations in the country, which should go live in 3 to 4 months.
Men der også dele af det danske samfund, som har behov for at komme videre. Der et erhvervsliv.
There's hope such documents could help shuttered businesses reopen and ease travel restrictions, removing the need to quarantine for those who've had a jab. The European Commission is considering its own scheme, which could enable travel across the bloc this summer. But questions remain over how to regulate the passes and how personal data should be stored.
Task that, as a team, we set ourselves was, how can we produce a vaccine certificate which in the end only has 2 bits of information in it? One is, has this person been vaccinated? And the other is, what does this person look like? You really don't need to know anything else at all.
Many airlines back the plans, and the International Air Transport Association has developed its own digital travel pass, a mobile application that would hold proof of coronavirus tests or vaccines. Etihad Airways and Emirates will be the first carriers to trial the application.
Moving now to the United States, where newly elected Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has been removed from 2 House committees, a move that was supported by all House Democrats and 11 Republicans. The Georgia lawmaker has gained notoriety for spreading unfounded conspiracy theories and endorsing violence online. The disciplinary actions sparking outrage among Republicans, some warning Democrats of potential political payback should they regain power in the lower chamber. Catherine Keder-Clifford takes a look.
A damning verdict from the House that's voted to strip Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of her committee assignments. All Democrats and 11 Republicans voted for the measure, arguing she had embraced far-right conspiracy theories and incited violence against fellow lawmakers.
Here she is, armed with a deadly assault rifle, pointing it toward 3 Democratic members. And some people who wanted to give other people nightmares committed sedition and broke into the House of Representatives and tried to stop us electing a president of the United States.
America's the greatest country in the world.
A staunch supporter of Donald Trump. Before she was elected, Marjorie Taylor Greene posted unfounded far-right QAnon conspiracy theories online. The Georgia representative also harassed high school shooting victims, having claimed and then retracted that the attacks were staged. Bipartisan pressure to punish Greene had been building since Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell called Greene's loony lies a cancer for the party. Though House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and others from the Republican leadership blasted the action, saying it shattered congressional precedent.
Never before in the history of this House has the majority abused its power in this way.
Ahead of the vote, Taylor Greene took to the podium where she expressed regret and retracted statements about U.S. tragedies that she had questioned in the past.
I also want to tell you 9/11 absolutely happened. I remember that day crying all day long watching it on the news.
In the 10-minute speech, she never directly apologized. The Democrats remained united against her, while she embodied more than any lawmaker the deep divides among Republicans since the departure of Trump.
Brazilian mining giant Vale has agreed to pay $7 billion in damages to the state of Minas Gerais following a dam collapse that left 270 people dead and several more still missing. The disaster 2 years ago saw tons of mining waste flood into a populated valley. Civil society groups decrying the fact that victims were not included in those settlement negotiations. Since mid-December, the Central African Republic has seen fighting between the National Army and a rebel coalition, with the violence centred around the capital. Normally, the country receives the majority of its goods by road from neighbouring Cameroon, but now the main routes in and out of Bangui are blocked and the city finds itself cut off from the world. Our correspondent Clément Diroma sent us this.
Hundreds of trucks have been stranded at the Central African border since rebels first launched attacks in mid-December. A dozen of trucks full of humanitarian supplies finally managed to make it into the country on February 3rd. But the corridor remains unpredictable and difficult to secure. That's had an effect on crucial supply routes in central Bangui. Food is scarce. Many Central Africans try to stock up by shopping in the PK5 district, but scarcity has meant prices just keep increasing.
Merci à Dieu, les gens passent un peu de l'autre côté du Congo. Et ça vient un peu, mais le grand route d'ici là, c'est bloqué complètement. Il n'y a rien qui vient.
On a peur. Si les prix augmentent encore beaucoup plus, là, on ne va pas s'en sortir et les activités seront bloquées.
Last month, the government announced the reopening of the main road that leads from Cameroon to the Central African capital. But that clearly didn't go as planned. A commercial convoy was attacked only a few days later. It is difficult to know how long stocks in the capital and in the regions will be able to continue supplying the markets. Some humanitarian organizations are already talking about the risk of famine and malnutrition in the region. Nearly 2 million people were already food insecure before the start of the fighting at the end of last year. The ongoing clashes have forced more than 240,000 people from their homes.
In recent years, bees have become something of a symbol of the eco-friendly movement as they face pressures from pesticide use to habitat loss and climate change. And now they have a new champion in the form of New York-based artist Matthew Wiley. As part of his Good of the Hive project, he's planning to hand-paint 50,000 bees on buildings around the world. And the project is already starting to generate some buzz.
My goal has always been to be in every type of neighborhood in the world. So that would be all of the continents, all of, I can't literally paint bees in every community, but to take a cross section and say, in every type of place, these bees have been painted, because I'm really, even though it is a healthy hive of bees that visually will be painted, it's really us. I'm painting the human race into this collective hive.
A reminder now of our top headlines today. The EU's top diplomat prepares to meet Russia's foreign minister, pressure growing to punish Moscow for jailing opposition leader Alexei Navalny and detaining thousands of his supporters. This war has to end. US President Joe Biden withdraws US support for a grinding 5-year-long military offensive in Yemen, saying it's time for US foreign policy to focus on diplomacy and democracy. And we head to the capital of the Central African Republic, Bangui, where food is becoming scarce and prices are rising amid an ongoing standoff between the army and a rebel coalition.